July 1944, Normandy. For the crew of a German MG42, the day has become a study in unnatural stillness. Their intelligence is clear. A British platoon is advancing across this very field, directly toward their position. But the landscape is empty, deceptively peaceful. The minutes stretch into an hour. Not a single helmet, not a shadow out of place. The silence itself becomes a threat. An entire enemy unit should be right there, in the open, but the field remains stubbornly vacant. It's as if they simply vanished into thin air. Where are they? This was not an isolated incident. From the hills of Italy to the fields of France, German after-action reports repeatedly described the same baffling phenomenon. British infantry that seemed to simply melt into the landscape. How could entire units cross deadly open ground, completely unseen by trained observers? This is the story not of battlefield ghosts, but of a calculated, lethal science of invisibility. But to understand this solution, we must first grasp the problem it was designed to overcome. The landscape of Normandy in the summer of 1944 was a fortress built by nature. This was the bocage, a patchwork of small fields, sunken lanes, and ancient, formidable hedgerows. These weren't simple fences. They were dense earthen walls, sometimes 10 feet high, tangled with trees and roots, impenetrable to tanks, and providing perfect cover for defenders. For a German machine gunner, each field was a self-contained killing ground. From his concealed position in the hedgerow, he had a clear, unobstructed view. The distances were known. The mortars were pre-sighted. Any textbook infantry attack, men advancing in formation across the open ground, was not a battle, it was an execution. The British Army learned this at a horrifying cost. In the brutal fighting around Caen, operations like Epsom and Goodwood bled infantry divisions white. Some units were suffering casualty rates comparable to the Somme in World War I, all to gain a few hundred yards of ground. The strategic pressure from high command was immense. Break out of the beachhead at all costs. But on the ground, for the platoon leaders and their men, the tactical problem seemed utterly unsolvable. Standard military doctrine was failing, and the price was being paid in lives. Faced with this bloody stalemate, commanders realized that bigger bombs and more artillery were not the answer. They had to find a way to cross the killing fields without being seen. They needed an advantage that wasn't forged in a factory, but learned in a different, much older school of conflict. The answer was found not in an engineering manual, but in the revival of a much older art of war. The key figure was a Scottish aristocrat, Simon Fraser, the 15th Lord Lovat. Decades earlier, his family had raised a unique unit for the Boer War, the Lovat Scouts, recruited from Highland gillies, gamekeepers, and professional deer stalkers. These were men whose very livelihood depended on their ability to move unseen across bare, open ground. Their philosophy, which began to filter into British infantry training, was a radical departure from military doctrine. The goal was not to hide in the landscape, it was to become the landscape. This wasn't about camouflage netting, it was a fundamental re-education in seeing, moving, and thinking. But what, in practice, did that mean for an ordinary infantryman, lying in the mud, with a German machine gunner watching his every move? For that infantryman, the answer began with a complete redefinition of his unit. A platoon of 30 men was no longer a single weapon. It was a collection of tiny, independent organisms. Standard doctrine was discarded. The textbook principle of fire and movement, where one section provides covering fire while another runs forward, was suicide here. It was replaced by something far slower, far more patient: observation and movement. The platoon would dissolve. It would break apart into 10 or 15 two-man teams, spreading out, each team an island of focused intent. While one team lay motionless, scanning the enemy hedgerow, another, perhaps 50 yards away, would begin its advance. But this was not an advance you could see. It was the art of the crawl. British fieldcraft manuals taught soldiers 5 types of crawl, from the high crawl for moving quickly behind low cover to the leopard crawl for crossing open ground. Soldiers moved on their elbows and knees, keeping their bodies flat against the earth, using every fold in the terrain. A shallow ditch, a furrow in a plowed field, a slight dip in the ground no more than a foot deep. These were the invisible highways. Movement was agonizingly slow, deliberate, and unnatural. A leg would extend, pause. An elbow would drag the body forward a few inches, pause. The rhythm was designed to mimic the swaying of grass or the shifting of shadows, to fool the peripheral vision of an observer. From the German perspective, this was a psychological battle. We return to the machine gunner in his concealed dugout. He scans the field, left to right, nothing. He looks at the sky, checks his ammunition belt, speaks to the man next to him. His eyes are tired. His brain is conditioned to look for the distinct, upright shape of an attacking soldier. It sees none. In the 15 seconds his attention is diverted, one of those two-man teams has just covered another 5 meters of ground and frozen solid. The gunner looks back. The field is exactly as it was, empty. The conscious mind registers safety, but a deeper, primal instinct feels a growing unease. The silence is too long. The stillness is too perfect. German after-action reports from Normandy and Italy are filled with this sense of bewilderment. They don't describe seeing an attack and repelling it. They describe a field being empty one moment, and then, impossibly, the enemy opening fire from a position 100 yards closer, with no one having seen them cross the space in between. This ghost-like movement was supported by a rigid set of rules, a catechism of invisibility. The first commandment, silhouette. Never, ever allow your shape to appear against the sky on a ridgeline. The second, shape. The human form is instantly recognizable. Helmets were covered in netting interwoven with strips of burlap, or scrim, to break up their perfect dome. Faces and hands were smeared with mud or camo cream. The third, shine. A watch face, a polished buckle, an officer's binoculars. A single glint of sunlight could betray the entire platoon. Everything was dulled, wrapped, or dirtied. And finally, sound. A cough, the clink of a canteen, a dislodged pebble, any noise carried for hundreds of yards in the stillness. But for the final, most dangerous part of the approach, there was one more tool. Not a massive artillery barrage, but a single, precisely aimed 2-inch mortar round. It wasn't meant to create a wall of smoke. It was a surgical tool, fired to land and create a small, temporary blind spot for just 10 to 15 seconds, blinding a specific machine gun nest while a team made the final dash into the dead ground right beneath the enemy's hedgerow. This level of fieldcraft, this patience, this absolute control over one's own body seems almost superhuman, but it was not a natural talent. It was a skill forged in the most desperate and brutal of training environments. This training was often led by instructors forged in Britain's colonial wars, men who had survived the lethal landscapes of India's northwest frontier, where this kind of fieldcraft wasn't a tactic, but a prerequisite for breathing. The school of invisibility, however, offered no guarantees. It was a tightrope walk over certain death. The price of a single mistake, a moment of impatience, the glint from a watch, a muffled cough, was absolute. For every platoon that successfully melted into the terrain, another was detected and systematically annihilated by machine gun and mortar fire. Now, knowing the method, the immense risk, and the terrible cost of failure, we can return to that field in Normandy. We are back in the German machine gun nest. The hour of waiting has turned vigilance into a dull certainty. The field is still empty. The gunner scans it one last time, seeing nothing, feeling secure behind a wall of steel and earth. Then, a sound. Not from the front, but from the flank. A sharp, violent tearing of the air, the unmistakable report of a Bren gun. It's impossibly close, less than 70 meters away. Before the German crew can even traverse their heavy MG42, a second Bren opens up. The British platoon has not just crossed the field, they have moved along the dead ground of the hedgerow itself, materializing where the defenders were blind. For the German gunners, the fight is over in seconds. The mystery is solved. The MG42 falls silent. The field is quiet once more. But this silence is no longer empty. The vanishing soldiers of Normandy were not a myth. They were the product of a brutal necessity, a doctrine proving that mastery of the land could overcome the technological dominance of the machine gun. It was more than a tactic. It became a psychological weapon, forcing defenders to fear the sight of an empty field. This was the infantry's answer to a battlefield where defensive firepower reigned supreme, a lesson in how to survive not just by fighting, but by disappearing. It proved that sometimes, the most decisive ground in a war isn't a hill or a town. The Germans were prepared to fight an army. They were not prepared for men who had mastered the art of becoming ghosts.